So, welcome to this evening's conference with Le Cercle des Langues. Today, we are discussing English for data storytelling, turning numbers into narratives. This evening's conference is for level B1 to B2. So, for the next 25 minutes, I will present the conference. And for the last 5 minutes, we will have a question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please put them on a piece of paper or you can put them into the chat and we will have a look at them after. So let's begin. Today's conference has 4 parts. The first part will talk about foundations of data storytelling. In our second part, we will look at understanding and communicating patterns. The third part, we will look at describing visuals and making them speak. And in the last part, we will look at building complete, impactful data narratives. So let's begin. Foundations of data storytelling. Data storytelling blends numbers with narrative purpose. So it transforms information into meaning, enabling audiences to understand complexity and feel connected to the insight. So not only the data. So a key tip is everybody or every story begins with why should they care? Why do stories enhance understanding? Stories anchor facts to experiences. So the brain recognizes patterns faster. Narratives guide attention, simplify complexity, and help audiences remember insights after the charts have faded. So we often use relatable situations to humanize data. So what makes a strong data story? A complex story uses context, visuals, clear structure, and targeted vocabulary. It avoids noise and leads listeners from observation to meaning, ultimately inspiring thoughtful decisions. One key tip is often use one message per slide. When you have one message per slide, this keeps the clarity alive. So when we look at vocabulary when talking about your core concepts, we look at things like insights, trends, patterns, the correlation, projection, narrative arc, takeaway, and visual cues. So let's look at how we introduce an insight. So this is an example dialogue, and we will see how it is done. A key tip is to remember that we need to summarize the message in one memorable sentence. So let's have a look at the dialogue and see if that is done effectively. David says, "This chart feels chaotic. What should I focus on?" Betty says, "Look at the rising trend after April. That's the story's heartbeat." So engagement grew steadily. Yes. And the consistency hints at deeper loyalty, meaning our new strategy works. Exactly. The numbers show steady confidence. We need to also learn how to understand and communicate patterns. So let's have a look at how to do that. It's important that we are able to identify trends clearly. Patterns make numbers readable. So for example, on the right, you can see what market growth looks like, and we can see the steady increase. because patterns help your audience see order in the data, like recognizing a rhythm in music. When you highlight patterns, the numbers stop looking random and they start telling a clear story. For example, sales increased steadily in winter and activity drops sharply near midnight. So patterns form the skeleton of your narrative. That is why it is always important to look for patterns or trends. We also should use comparatives for clarity. For example, this month performed better than last month. Mobile engagement is stronger than desktop traffic. Email conversions grew faster this week than social media interactions. So, if you would like to participate, write one example with a comparative in the chat. Compare only equivalent categories for accuracy. So, let's give it a try. If you would like to, you can put your answers in the chat. How would you use the comparative to show contrast? So, if, for example, we could always say that our social media engagement was higher than it was last month. So, that's an example we could use. A second example we could also say that, for example, our sales are more successful than they were in the last few months. So, these are just examples of how we can use the comparative to give higher contrast or to highlight contrast. How do we express cause and effect? When you show that what caused a change and what effect it produced, your audience can follow the logic of your data. For example, because engagement rose, retention improved. Since traffic fell, we adjusted the posting schedule. A key tip is to explain one cause at a time to stay clear. So, interesting vocabulary we can look at is, for example, trends and movement. We talk about things that increase and things that decrease. We talk about a peak, which is the highest point, and a dip, which is the lowest point. We talk about something that is stable or its fluctuation. We look at something that can rise sharply or gradually. Let's have a look at an example dialogue of someone who is explaining a trend. Why did visits peak in July? Betty says our summer campaign spiked attention immediately. Did people react fast? Within 2 days, the curve rose dramatically. Did the interest last? Mostly through mobile. Desktop stayed moderate. So a key tip is to mention time and the reason when we are explaining trends. A part of grammar that is very useful is when we use modals to create balanced interpretations. Using modals like might, could, and may help you give honest, careful conclusions from your data. For example, the data might suggest growing interest. This behavior could indicate seasonal habits because the idea is that modals keep analysis honest. So you are not saying that something is a certain way. You are giving a good guess in saying it could be the reason. Some vocabulary that we could use in this section is suggest, reveal, indicate, demonstrate, highlight, predict, recommend, and conclude. So how do we give a recommendation? Let's look at the dialogue and see. What should we do with these numbers? The data suggests reinforcing mobile content. Do we have solid evidence? Mobile interactions consistently outperform others. So mobile becomes our growth engine. Exactly. The trend points that way. And as you look at the dialogue, a key tip would be a recommendation needs a reason, not intuition. That means if we are going to recommend something, we need to say why. It's important so that it gives you a concrete method of moving forward. And how does describing visuals, how do we describe our visuals? And how do we make them speak? We need to look at describing charts with precision. And something that is very helpful is when we use clear verbs that bring visuals alive. Strong, simple verbs like rise, drop, and stabilize help people imagine the movement in your charts. With the right verbs, your visuals feel dynamic. The line rises steadily after March. Teenagers' bar stands significantly higher. Customers' interest spikes sharply at the start of the campaign. So besides using verbs, what we can use are line graphs. A line graph shows how something changes step by step, making the journey of the data visible. It helps your audience track progress, trends, or surprises across weeks, months, or years. For example, energy use drops sharply on weekends, and then you can have a line graph to show that. The curve climbs slowly as adoption increases. So for the vocabulary we use when making a visual analysis is we talk about the axis. Then we talk about the labels. We also can talk about the segment or the distribution, the spike or the plateau, the cluster or the ranking. Let's look at a dialogue example. Eden says, "What does the tallest bar mean?" Rita responds, "It marks our strongest sales period this quarter." And the smallest one? Demand fell after the holidays. Does this change our plan? Definitely. We must reinforce low periods. A key tip would be to always connect visuals to actions. So, judging by what your visuals tell you, it is important that you then add what is a good way to act in order to alter the dip or the change. Something that's quite important is how we use emotion. And one of the things we look at is using emotion ethically. in data stories. Emotion strengthens retention when used responsibly. A touch of emotion, so for example, curiosity, surprise, or concern, helps people remember your message and connect with your data. When used wisely, emotion supports understanding instead of distracting from the facts. A key tip is to anchor every emotional point in factual evidence. Something that's very important is that we avoid data overload. That means keeping the essential figures, avoiding unnecessary decimals, and removing visuals that don't support your central message. Because unfortunately, too many numbers weaken the message clarity. So we only need to use the information that is necessary and vital to what we are trying to show. Building complete, impactful data narratives. Numbers become powerful when they touch people. So it's important to mention the context, to mention the dates, and to mention the most relevant data regarding the consequences. Context gives shape to data. So for example, our survey covered 5 regions. We observed behavior over 3 months. We analyzed 60 responses. Context prepares the audience for the insight. And when we are talking about context, we are looking at background, audience impact, emotional response, behavior, strategic decisions, and our message clarity. So let's look at a dialogue that talks about delivering the final story. Carl says, "What's the main idea of your analysis?" Brenda responds, "The data shows strong growth among young users." Why does that matter? Younger audiences drive future stability. So what's our next step? Invest in features designed for them. In conclusion, a strong data story breathes purpose into numbers. It guides attention, sparks curiosity, and inspires thoughtful action. When numbers gain a voice, they help us imagine the future with sharper, more compassionate vision. So I'd like to thank you for watching this conference with Le Cercle des Langues. The vocabulary was quite complex. So it's very important that you download the PDF from the chat so that you have it and that you can review the terms that we used for the different parts that you will use in your presentations.